Hello, welcome to the lecture over Chapter 4, Promoting Democracy. So in this lecture, we are going to discuss democracy. We're going to look at how democracy has expanded across the world, why the expansion has been uneven, and why democratic systems are currently under strain in many of the regions across the globe. Although democracy became far more common as a form of government during the 20th century, especially after World War II and the Cold War, the growth itself has not been linear. Economic inequality, declining trust in political institutions, perceptions that governments primarily serve elites have really weakened democratic legitimacy in many societies. And at the same time, globalization and new communication technologies have transformed political participation, enabling citizens to mobilize rapidly while also challenging traditional forms of democratic accountability. And so by the end of this lecture, you should be able to do a few things. You should be able to recall some of the basic elements that are needed for democracies to flourish. You'll be able to describe how democratic transitions unfold in different regional contexts, and you'll be able to explain how globalization and global governance complicate democratic accountability. And so what we're doing here is we're moving from foundational concepts to applied case studies in the readings, and those will help to really emphasize how theory and practice often diverge in real-world democratic development. So democracy is commonly defined as the rule by the people, or the people are the sovereigns, right? But the definition really leaves open important questions about who counts as the people or how their preferences are translated into political outcomes. Historically, democracy was limited to a small number of countries, mostly in Western Europe and North America. But today, democratic institutions exist in a variety of regions across the world. Yet public confidence in democracy has declined recently, both in established and in newer democracies. And so understanding this tension between democratic expansion and democratic dissatisfaction is important for evaluating contemporary political systems. So let's begin. Early democratic systems, most notably in ancient Greece, relied on direct participation, with citizens voting on themselves, right, on public decisions. That is, with qualification that we know that who the Greek considered citizens, right, for participation was quite limited. However, this limiting of the number of people who were directly involved made that direct democracy possible. And for that reason, modern democracies operate very differently, right? Because of population size, territorial scale, citizens primarily participate indirectly by electing representatives through what we call republicanism or republican democracy. This system itself raises fundamental questions about political authority, about representation, about accountability, particularly when elected officials pursue policies that diverge from popular preferences. We do have two different approaches that we will be discussing here. We have a majoritarian and a consensus approach. The majoritarian model emphasizes majority rule, right? It prioritizes efficiency and clear outcomes, right? And so what this is typically the most votes is majoritarian. Rule is what we would call it. You can think of that as 50% plus one, and plurality voting is most votes win. But a plurality falls under a majoritarian type of model. And so this is just whoever gets the most votes in a group, right? Whatever group receives the most votes. The consensus model, on the other hand, seeks a broader inclusion by incorporating minority voices through the structure of the electoral system itself, either through proportional representation, which is the most common, or through strong parties with lists. There's also different types of voting systems, ranked choice voting to help reach more consensus candidates. But again, the idea is by incorporating these voices into the structure of the system itself is what makes it consensus. They're looking for broader inclusion. And so while both these models differ institutionally, they're both aiming to do the same thing, which is to translate public preferences into policy. Again, they both face challenges in balancing governability with inclusiveness, but they both reach that goal through different ways, through different methods, or attempt to. It's important to note that democracy requires more than electoral competition, right? Liberal democracy depends on constitutional liberalism, which limits state power and protects individual rights regardless of electoral outcomes. That is, it doesn't matter if a Democrat or a Republican is in office, you should still have the same protections and they should still have the same limitations. Right? And these protections include things like freedom of expression, religious liberty, property rights, equality before the law. Constitutions institutionalize these principles by defining where that government authority lies, right? It establishes accountability mechanisms, and it helps to ensure that political power is exercised within these legal constraints. Political participation refers to the way citizens engage with the political system, right, in order to primarily influence decision making. Conventional participation includes things like voting, party membership, campaigning, interest group activity. Unconventional participation includes things like protest, civil disobedience, and these types of protests often emerge when formal channels fail to address grievances. Both forms are integral to the democratic system, particularly for the unconventional during periods of social or political change, though both are important during social and political change. You'll see more unconventional during those times. And conventional versus unconventional just means what are the ones we typically see or that people typically engage in, and then what are some that come out but aren't the ones that we typically use, like marching in a protest versus is unconventional because people don't generally protest on a consistent basis on issues. They will write letters, right, but not quite protest. And so that's just conventional versus unconventional. It doesn't mean unusual in terms of extreme, just to make sure that's clear. So women's political participation has historically been limited by a combination of legal exclusions, cultural norms, structural inequalities, all of which are embedded within political systems. Right? In most political systems, women were, until recently, formally excluded from things like voting, holding office, or owning property. Right? Women in the United States until the 1970s were prohibited from owning their own bank accounts or having credit cards in their name. So even after these legal barriers were removed, informal social expectations continued to restrict women's access to political power by framing politics as a masculine activity that was tied to authority, leadership, and public life. Political scientists Najma Chowdhury and Barbara J. Nelson describe this pattern as the maleness of politics, right? They say it emphasizes how political institutions evolved within patriarchal systems that normalized male dominance and marginalized women's voices. And these barriers are reinforced by broader socioeconomic factors, right? Again, women on average have had less access to education, to financial resources, and to the professional networks thereof that help to facilitate entry into politics. So in many societies, women also shoulder a disproportionate caregiving responsibility, which limits the time and flexibility that's required for political engagement. And so as a result, women have been underrepresented not only in legislatures and executive offices, but also within political parties themselves, which are the places where candidates are recruited primarily, right, in interest group activity, and so less focus paid to women's issues or that issues that particularly affect women, and again, absent from other institutions that are central to democratic participation. And so, from a democratic perspective, these patterns pose a fundamental legitimacy problem, right? If democracy is based on political equality and popular rule, systematic exclusion of women undermines its core principles. And so, expanding women's political participation is therefore not simply this matter of fairness, but it is a necessary condition for democratic credibility and for effective representation. And the case for expanding women's political participation rests on three interrelated arguments. The first is equity and democratic justice, right? Democracy is premised on political equality, and systems that exclude women violate this foundational principle. The second argument focuses on representation of women's interests, right? Women often experience politics differently than men due to disparities in income, caregiving responsibilities, access to health care, and exposure to violence, to name a few. Without women in decision-making roles, these interests are less likely to be addressed. And the third argument emphasizes the effective use of human resources, right? So democracies that exclude women fail to draw on the full range of skills, experiences, and leadership capacity necessary for effective governance and institutional development. Women's political participation has increased across much of the world, though it has been uneven due to severe structural and global forces that influence women's participation. So first, globalization has facilitated the emergence of transnational networks that raise political awareness and that enable women to mobilize locally, nationally, and internationally. Second, there have been institutional reforms like gender quotas or targeted recruitment efforts, as well as changes to electoral systems that have lowered barriers to entry. And third, the end of the Cold War shifted political priorities away from these traditional security concerns and towards more domestic governance and social policy areas. And these are focuses in which women effectively articulated their leadership and policy expertise, right? And so these dynamics help to explain why women have attained leadership positions in both the established democracies and in countries undergoing democratic transition, though there are still significant gaps in representation. And again, the pace is unevenly distributed. So what are some factors conducive to democracy? Well, democracy is likely to develop and endure when there is a supportive social, economic, and cultural conditions, right? Political cultures that value things like tolerance, compromise, and participation typically foster democratic stability, right? Because if people are willing to talk to each other and solve things with one another, they are more likely to be able to move things forward. Whereas if there's intolerance, unwillingness to compromise, and a push to disenfranchise or limit participation, well, then you are creating a system that is undemocratic, right? And so it makes sense that you would want these values to help include people and to induce stability and more holistic communal flourishing. Economic development and education also increase political awareness and engagement. And so having economically developed, or at least the potential to develop economically present, makes a big difference because people are able to then afford their basic necessities, for one, right? And then they are able to move past meeting basic needs to being able to engage in leisure activities. And this also helps to spread the amount of the population that can then become educated. And education increases, again, political awareness and political engagement. And we can see this in data across democracies, right? The more educated a population is, or the more economically advantaged it is, the more likely these groups are to participate. And the more educated and these two things are tied together as well, right? The more educationally advanced you are, the higher your level of educational attainment, the higher level your economic attainment also goes. Of course, it's not a perfect linear relationship, but this really helps to induce a politically minded, a politically aware class that is engaged with the government. Again, the population needs to have that culture of participation, right, for that democratic stability, and people who are economically independent and who have more education become more participatory, more aware. And then, of course, this leads to the third, which is that strong middle class. This is often associated with the demands for accountability, legal protections, responsive governance, because a strong middle class indicates that a wide berth of the population has access to things beyond their immediate necessities, who have access to education, who have access to leisure time, who have access to the ability to participate in civic society. And so when you have a lot of participation, people can get together and demand accountability or work on issues that are affecting particular groups to ensure that the legal protections exist there and that the government is responsive to the population in this way. Understanding that institutions, we can talk about in the United States, institutions like gerrymandering, right, that distort the voice, right? So there are some anti-democratic practices that exist even within more stable democracies. But as long as these groups exist, right, even with those structural obstacles in place, the democracy is relatively stable and the people can still create a responsive government. So, promoting democracy. The promotion of democracy became this central objective of international politics after the end of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union collapsed and it was removed as this major ideological and strategic barrier to the United States, particularly, and to democratic expansion idealistically. And so during the Cold War, right, many Western governments, particularly the United States, prioritized containing communism over supporting democratic principles, and they often formed alliances with authoritarian regimes, and this has consequences, right? But once that rivalry ended, right, once that rivalry was over, democracy promotion increasingly became framed as this moral responsibility, as well as a practical strategy for achieving global stability, partly based on the democratic peace theory, which is that democracies are more stable and therefore less likely to go to war with other democracies. Western governments and international organizations began linking economic assistance, diplomatic recognition, and development aid to democratic reforms during this time period. Democracy promotion was therefore no longer treated like an internal matter, but it became a legitimate concern of the international community itself. The shift was reflected in initiatives such as the Warsaw Declaration, right, which was signed by representatives of more than half the world's countries, and this committed signatories to supporting democratic development in countries lacking democratic institutions, as well as strengthening democracy where it already existed. And so these efforts signaled the emergence of a global consensus that democracy was not only desirable, but necessary for long-term peace, development, and cooperation. And at the same time, the promotion of democracy has been uneven and contested, right? So while there are these external pressures and incentives that encourage democratic reforms in some cases, in others they have generated resistance, especially when democracy promotion is perceived as coercive or tied too closely to external interests from the country that is being induced to democratize. And as a result, democracy promotion has taken on multiple forms, right, ranging from diplomatic engagement and economic assistance to election monitoring or to support for civil society, with varying degrees of success around the globe. Global civil society refers to networks of individuals, organizations, and associations that operate across national borders in order to influence outcomes and to promote democratic norms. Unlike governments, these actors are considered non-state actors, and they are typically voluntary organizations, but they still play a role, an increasingly important one at that, in global politics by linking local political struggles to international audiences and institutions. Right. So global civil society includes non-governmental organizations, or NGOs, advocacy networks, foundations, professional associations, and other grassroots movements that are connected by these shared goals and values. And one of the defining features of global civil society is its ability to blur the boundary between domestic and international politics. So organizations often work simultaneously at the local, national, and global levels. So, supporting democratic change from the ground up while also exerting pressure on governments at the international institutions is a typical strategy of these groups. Groups such as Civicus exert pressure on governments and international institutions by bringing together hundreds of other NGOs around the world. And so, this type of action illustrates how institutions help overcome the collective action problem and how that collective action can then amplify and influence democratic advocacy across various regions. Global civil society contributes to democratization in concrete ways as well. The organizations provide civic education. They help organize and fund political parties and interest groups. They assist with drafting constitutions. They help to monitor elections. They mediate political conflicts, right? Election observations, for example, lend credibility, right, to electoral processes, and they can deter fraud or violence. Foundations and NGOs also support things like independent media, legal reform, human rights monitoring, all of which are essential to sustaining democratic institutions. Former President Jimmy Carter of Georgia, right, exemplifies the role that individuals can play in global civil society through creating their own initiatives like the Carter Center. And the Carter Center has monitored elections and has been a voice in support of democratic reforms worldwide. The United States has played this prominent and often, admittedly, controversial role in promoting democracy abroad. Throughout its history, U.S. foreign policy has oscillated between isolationism, right, the belief that the United States should serve as this moral example or beacon on a hill, and this active intervention aimed at reshaping political systems in other countries, right? American leaders have frequently framed democracy promotion as this universal moral mission, and they typically equate U.S. values with broadly applicable principles of political freedom and self-serving determination, as though the values that are held by the U.S. are universal. During the Cold War, democracy promotion was heavily shaped by the ideological rivalry that the U.S. had with the Soviet Union. Right, anti-communism was a dominant objective, right, and that often, abolishing anti-communism or abolishing communism was that dominant objective, and that objective typically overrode democratic considerations. Right, consider the McCarthy era and the Red Scare in the United States as examples, and so as a result, the United States supported or even tolerated authoritarian regimes all over the world: Africa, Asia, Latin America, the Middle East. And they did this when those authoritarian regimes were seen as strategic allies. And so this approach reflected what scholars describe as a consequentialist ethic, and that is an ethics practice here in which preventing the spread of communism was treated as a moral end that justified these questionable means, right? And after that, after the Cold War, the United States sort of pulled back from these anti-democratic alliances and placed this renewed emphasis on democracy and democratic promotion through diplomatic engagement, again, through economic assistance, institutional support, programs administered through organizations like the National Endowment for Democracy or the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID, funded things like election administration, constitution writing, judicial reform, civil society development. Voices of America delivered media, news, and information. However, these efforts continue to face significant obstacles, right? Inadequate resources, lack of sustained domestic consensus, competing foreign policy priorities. The United States, as the time of this lecture, right, the Trump administration having taken U.S. aid apart. And so these types of things limit the applying of U.S. democratic models to societies across the globe, but they also limit the way those societies with different historical, culture, and economic conditions receive the efforts that the United States exerts. So let's discuss some changes in democracy around the world, or changing to democracy primarily. This is transitions to democracy are referred to as democratization, right? And democratization refers to the process by which a political system transitions from authoritarian or totalitarian rule to a democratic form of government, and that form of government also has to be regarded as legitimate and enduring, right? So the process of doing this is not automatic and it's not uniform across cases. Uh, Democratic transitions are messy, right? They typically begin with liberalization, and that involves loosening state control over political life, right? And that can include things like greater freedom of speech and of the press, reduced censorship, maybe recognition of labor rights, fewer arbitrary arrests, the release of political prisoners, and of course, an increased tolerance for political opposition. And so while liberalization creates this political space, it doesn't by itself produce democracy, right? So democratization is a broader and more demanding process. It requires the establishment of competitive elections, meaningful political competition, institutions capable of exercising authority. And it's important to note that the text does caution against what's known as the electoral fallacy, right? That assumption that holding elections alone is sufficient for democracy. In many transitioning systems, former authoritarian elites actually retain significant power from behind the scenes, right? And they exercise the power to limit the effectiveness and autonomy of newly elected governments, right? We can look at Venezuela and Maduro in terms of this electoral fallacy and exercising power as a government without legitimately winning an election. A democratic transition is considered complete only when democratic rules and institutions are widely accepted by political elites, by the citizens, and, importantly, by the international community. Juan Linz and Alfred Steppen, political scientists, argue that consolidation occurs when there is agreement on democratic procedures, when elected governments have real authority to govern, and when executive, legislative, and judicial powers are clearly separated. Beyond formal institutions, democracy must also deliver tangible benefits, right? There has to be economic opportunity, the ability to improve one's lot in life, right? There has to be public order. There have to be improved quality of life measures here, right? And that is, again, to gain legitimacy among citizens. Many transitions, particularly those that are led by military regimes, are what are called managed transitions. And these are designed to control political change and typically to protect elite interests. So in these cases, the military or the ruling elites, they'll set a timetable, they'll shape the electoral rules, and generally limit the scope of reform. Right, so consolidating democracy is this long-term process that involves behavioral changes, cultural changes, attitudinal acceptance of democratic norms, as well as institutional developments. Democracies are then consolidated when governments are no longer challenged by force, when citizens believe democracy is preferable to its alternatives, when civil society, the rule of law, and an independent judiciary are firmly established, right? And when we look at what's called democratic backsliding, we'll ask questions about these same things, right? Is there challenge by force to the current government? Do the citizens believe that democracy is preferable to the alternative forms of government? Keeping in mind that there is typically a section of the population that is not insignificant that will consistently answer on surveys that they prefer other forms of government as opposed to democracy. And then, of course, we'll ask, is civil society under threat or existent? Is the rule of law still in existence, or is it under threat? Is there an independent judiciary, right? Again, we just ask the opposite to check the health. And so when we talk about democratization and levels of democracy, these are some of the measures that we look at as political scientists when establishing what level of democracy some state or country is at, and is it moving up or down on that scale. So let's move on to our next section, global governance. So globalization has really fundamentally altered where political authority is exercised, and it often has shifted power away from democratically elected national governments towards more regional and global institutions. So while states remain formally sovereign, right, their ability to regulate economic activity, for instance, or environmental policy, finance policy, security, right, it's increasingly constrained by global rules and by agreements between those states and others. So this creates a tension between democratic accountability at the national level and decision-making at the global level, right, where citizens have limited ability to influence the outcomes through elections. And so the concept of this democratic deficit, right, captures this gap between power and accountability. Many global institutions like international financial organizations or trade regimes, you can think of the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, or the World Trade Organization, the WTO, make decisions that directly affect citizens' lives. Yet those citizens can't easily vote on decision makers in those offices out of office or hold them accountable through any of the traditional democratic mechanisms at their disposal at the national or local level. And so contemporary debates surround organizations like the IMF and the WTO. And global climate governance highlights concerns that economic globalization can actually weaken democratic control if not accompanied by some stronger mechanisms for some representation or for some transparency, preferably both together. International regimes, as we use the term here, are a set of rules, norms, procedures, institutions, right, that govern cooperation in specific issue areas like trade or finance or security, the environment. These regimes arise from growing interdependence among states, and they're designed to help to coordinate behavior to solve that collective action problem and to help reduce uncertainty and infuse some stability. Examples include things like global trade regimes centered on the WTO or the World Trade Organization, financial regimes involving the IMF or the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and environmental regimes like the Paris Climate Agreement. And while international regimes facilitate cooperation, they also reflect underlying power asymmetries in the international system. Right? Powerful states and groups of states often shape the rules and they shape the enforcement mechanisms to reflect their interests. So as a result, smaller or developing countries may have limited influence over decision making. And this imbalance raises democratic concerns, particularly when regime policies impose economic or social costs on populations without any meaningful input or representation from those affected populations. Perceptions of democratic deficits in global governance have generated sustained debate, right? Debate about how to make the global institutions more accountable, how to make them more transparent, how to make them more representative. One proposed reform focuses on changing how rules and procedures are formulated and implemented. The thought is here that doing so will allow broader participation in agenda setting rather than limiting influence to powerful states or technocratic elites. A second proposal emphasizes reforming representation, particularly to give developing countries greater voice and voting power in global institutions. A third approach calls for expanding participation beyond governments by incorporating civil society actors like NGOs or labor organizations, advocacy groups into the decision-making process. There are additional reforms to include things like increasing transparency so that decisions are visible and understandable to the public, or enforcing judicial-style accountability mechanisms that evaluate whether institutions are acting within their legal authority. And so these proposals reflect themselves an ongoing effort to recognize or to reconcile globalization with democratic norms rather than abandoning global cooperation altogether. And so here we look back and in this lecture we have discussed how there is a lot of diversity among the different forms of democracies throughout the world, right? Democracy as a global phenomenon is shaped by political institutions, by social conditions, by economic development, and by international forces. And so democracy requires more than elections, right? It depends on things like constitutional limits, civil liberties, meaningful participation, accountable governance. Transitions to democracy are complex. They're often fragile. They're shaped by historical legacies. They're shaped by elite behavior, by popular expectations. right? We discussed civil society, both domestic and global, and how they it plays a crucial role in pressuring governments to reform and in sustaining democratic practices. And at the same time, globalization has complicated democracy and democratic accountability in particular by shifting authority beyond the nation state, raising concerns about democratic deficits in global governance. Despite these challenges, democratic ideas continue to shape political struggles worldwide as citizens seek greater voice, greater representation, and greater accountability in both national and global politics. Right? And remember, the solution here isn't to just simply pull away from the international or global world because of that lack of accountability, but is to reform it to include that type of accountability. All right, well, that is it for this lecture. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to contact me. Otherwise, have a great rest of your day.